Do we have too much government?
We need to put people ahead of corporate profits.
This system is so lopsided. This threat is a real threat to democracy.
And I think that's really important. That's something we haven't been doing in this country for a long time.
Where do you start? What do you do? How do you do it?
Access to Democracy and other Eagan community television programming is supported by Thomson Reuters, makers of Westlaw Next and based in Eagan. Through Westlaw Next and other innovative online services, Thomson Reuters is the world's leading source of intelligent information for businesses and professionals. Online at thomsonreuters.com. And by U.S. Federal Credit Union, the member-owned financial institution offering service, value, and experience you can trust to the greater Twin Cities community.
Welcome. Access to Democracy returns, and we have a return guest with a new title. Representative Paul Thissen, and welcome back.
Thank you.
Who is now the minority leader in the House of Representatives.
Right.
And with last year's bizarre election in which the Republicans took control of both houses in Minnesota, Paul moved up to the #1 spot for the Democrats, and he speaks for the sane side.
Okay.
I remember the Republicans running on jobs, 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 deficit, deficit, deficit. Now, I made a list of some things that they have focused their attention on. Abortion, vouchers in schools, casino, raiding the Metro Transit Fund, healthcare cutbacks, local government assistance cutbacks, private prisons, Sunday liquor, teacher tenure, pensions, unions. We have the 6th worst state deficit per capita in the country. Not one of those things creates jobs. What's going on over there?
Well, I think that's a good and a fair question for people to be asking. The reality is everybody at the beginning of session said we're going to focus on the budget deficit and jobs. You're absolutely right. We have been distracted, and there's other things, repealing pay equity, making Minnesota an English-only state. I mean, things that really are distractions from what the main work over there is. What we're seeing in terms of jobs out of the proposals and the budgets coming from the Republican majorities in the legislature is exactly the opposite of creating jobs. It's destroying jobs. I mean, in their budgets, there are public sector jobs, thousands of them that would be eliminated. These are middle-class jobs, middle-class families' jobs, their paychecks. But we're also seeing huge numbers of private sector jobs being lost. Police and firefighters, well, those are public sector, but hospital employees, nurses and doctors getting laid off. We're seeing 550 jobs just in the transit bill alone. They're eliminating funding for the bus service, essentially in greater Minnesota, and half of it in the metro area. That's 550 jobs. So they're going the opposite direction. They're continuing to squeeze middle-class families and then charge them to do it with higher tuitions, with rapidly increasing property taxes.
Now, the House presented a budget, and I understand that it was too vague for really comprehension by the commissioners to even respond to it. I also understand that in some cases the budget was presented by the Republicans with no hearings. In other cases where they had commissioners on, they were limited to 3 or 3.5 minutes to discuss multi-million-dollar budgets. What's the story there?
Well, it's very frustrating that the Republicans really are using monopoly money to fill in budget gaps. So they have committee chairs that say, I'm going to take $60 million to fill this hole. I know it's illegal to take it, but I got to make my budget work. Or in the Health and Human Services area, probably over $1 billion in money that we can't document will actually be saved by the proposals that they're putting forward. The reason they're doing it is this. They ran on this notion that we need to live within our means, as they keep repeating, and that we don't need any more revenues in the state. They put out budget targets that generally adopted that philosophy, and now they've cut and cut and cut deep and devastating cuts, raised property taxes, and they still have $1 billion or more to go to finish the budget, to fill the budget hole that we're facing. They can't do it with cuts alone. They're to the point in saying, we've cut and cut, even we as Republicans can't cut any further, and so they're making up money to fill in the rest of the gaps. It really gives the lie to the rhetoric about living within your means.
Now, we had a 3-year governor by the name of Pawlenty. His 4th year was spent campaigning for the presidency, and I wish him and Michelle Bachmann the best. They should knock each other out. But Pawlenty's adage was no new taxes. But that was a fallacy. It was a lie. Taxes kept getting added. For instance, to property taxes, where ours have almost doubled here in Eagan. In the 8 years that Pawlenty was in, we got hit with additional fees. And he also slashed local government aid or assistance, and that affected everybody, also the cities and people in their homes, people on fixed incomes in particular. This seems to be more of the same. Now, we had 2 terms of W, created no new jobs. We keep hearing that if you damage the top 1%, if you make, and I won't, I'll get to fairness and taxation, that it will create jobs. It didn't under Bush. It didn't under Pawlenty. Where are the jobs?
Right. Well, this budget is looking backwards. It is the Tim Pawlenty budget that the Republicans are proposing on steroids. And you're absolutely right. There were new revenues that came in. Property taxes up $3 billion in Pawlenty's term. In the new budget proposal in the House, another $1.4 billion over the next 4 years. Those are going to hit those seniors. They're going to hit middle-class families, and that's what the Pawlenty budget was all about, was squeezing middle-class families. The Republicans continue down that path, and you're absolutely right. It didn't create jobs. Everybody that goes out and says if we tax the richest Minnesotans even a little bit, we're going to lose jobs, is rewriting history, because it absolutely, when we were cutting those taxes, it didn't create jobs. You are absolutely right, and Minnesotans need to understand that.
And the fact of the matter is, and I'm sorry even that the governor described it as taxing the rich, because it's not taxing the rich. It's really leveling the playing field. It's really getting rid of disparities in taxation. Under previous governors, the highest Minnesotans in terms of income got taxed a lot more than they are now. That's when the state was way up there in education, in health care, in so many areas, all of which have fallen. So, I mean, can't they see the falsehood of that philosophy?
Well, this is the discussion we're going to have, at the Capitol over the next couple of weeks. But you're absolutely right, and the tax incidence study that we talk about, which says how much each kind of middle-income people are paying in total taxes versus the richest Minnesotans and the poorest Minnesotans. It remains in the most recent one that came out about a week ago that the richest Minnesotans are paying a couple percentage less in their total income than middle-class Minnesotans. We have to stop that squeeze, and that's exactly what the governor is saying. Let's just have some fairness. The most interesting thing to me in the last week has been when the Republican leaders in the legislature have been asked, well, everybody talks about shared responsibility and shared sacrifice. Where are the richest Minnesotans sharing in this sacrifice? And they don't have an answer to that question because it doesn't exist. What they're doing is protecting the richest Minnesotans from paying even a dime more to prevent cuts to nursing homes, to prevent cuts to schools. They're protecting their corporate friends at the expense of the middle class. And that is really the fundamental fight that's happening at the legislature and across the country, but at the legislature this year.
And they're also attacking things such as Wisconsin. Now, we saw how successful the Wisconsin effort was. In fact, I think there'll be another 100,000 people out tomorrow protesting what's going on in Wisconsin. And interesting, I was watching television last night, And I heard where Governor Walker spoke of 8,000 emails that came in one day that were favorable to his position. The Associated Press sued under the Freedom of Information Act, and it cost the state $7,000 to defend and lose that suit. The Associated Press said 5-1. They were in opposition to the governor.
Is that right?
So in addition to being a liar, he can't add.
Okay. Well, I mean, I think you raise a very important point, and the thing that Minnesotans should know is, although there's not a single package of the same kind of attacks on worker protections that you see in Wisconsin, if you put all the Republican bills together, it's the same package. And really, it comes back to what we were just talking before earlier. To me, this is something that's a national effort being handed down out of Washington, D.C., that the Republicans are pursuing, really to distract people from the fact and divide middle-class families from middle-class families so that they can continue down the path of protecting their corporate interests and rich donors.
What I don't understand is how people sometimes vote against their own self-interest. Like the woman last year who I said, I don't want government involved in my life. Don't touch my Medicare. Hello? Or don't touch my Social Security, it was. Social Security, one of the most successful programs this country has ever seen, instituted under a Democratic administration. The Civil Rights Act, another certainly successful program, instituted under a Democratic we'll get it right if we keep going at it, administration. I mean, you look down, unions, the benefits of unions. Where did the 40-hour week come from? Where did pension plans come from? Where did lunch hours come from? Where did all the things that have come out of the union movement come from? And they're now trying to destroy the unions because unions are generally supportive of Democrats. But they don't seem to care that the same people that they're destroying are the middle class that they say that they're protecting.
Well, and I think it seems to me that one of the reasons that all this is happening right now is because we have adopted policies over the last 30 years, both at the state and federal level, that really is squeezing the middle class. The economy is not working for middle class Americans anymore. And what we need to return to is an economy that does. I mean, when you have the 400 richest Americans having the same amount of wealth as the bottom 150 million, there's something wrong in our society, and it's ultimately going to fundamentally undermine our economic recovery, because if you don't put money in the pockets of middle-class Minnesotans, they're not going to have the money to spend to keep this economy going, right? So that is, that's what this fight, if you will, politically right now is all about at the national level, but it's certainly true at the state level. So cutting middle-class jobs in the state through the budget cuts that they're proposing, cutting $500 million out of the higher education budget, which is going to drive up tuitions again by another $200 million.
To students who can't afford it now.
Right, who can't afford it now.
I know in the community college level, we've had students who've had to drop out, and they say it's to earn money to come back in a year or two, but sometimes a year or two is a very long time.
Right.
And you lose those students, you lose the education, we lose it in research and development for our hospitals and our clinics, and we lose the push in science that we have had that have made us one of the cutting-edge states in that regard. It's so counterproductive that I just am so frustrated that people cannot see this.
No, well, I agree with you, but part of that is our job, yours, in what you do here, and my job is to go and talk to people about what's really going on. So I really appreciate the chance to do this and have this conversation.
Well, you're going to leave here with a DVD. I hope you cut copies and send it to every cable unit in the state. MACTA is a good system, and we reach just about everybody.
That's great.
And
yep, absolutely.
That's the type of thing we have to do. We have a really good, aggressive new leader in Ken Martin. Ken was here a few weeks ago, and I am hopeful that he will shake some of the lethargy out of what were the voters' last election as we push to 2012, which will be an Obama election, which will be an Amy Klobuchar election, and which the whole legislature will be up again.
That's correct.
We have a great opportunity there to take back the Senate, to take back the House, and to take back some sanity in government.
Right, and we're very much looking forward to the 2012 election. You know, we lost control of the State House of Representatives by 6 seats, but really only a total of between 400 and 500 votes. So the opportunities to not just to win back the House for Democrats, but I think win back the House for what is a policy that's much more consistent with where most Minnesotans are and the values of Minnesotans, I think is really critically important. But what it is going to require is for people to really pay attention. I think one of the things that's happened after Wisconsin and all that's gone on over there next door really has awakened people to the protections that sometimes we take for granted in this state as well, and that they can disappear if people don't stand up and get engaged and involved.
Well, Governor Walker has been the gift who keeps on giving, and I think he has done a lot to stimulate people who were just sitting back and unaware of what is going on. A lot of people sat back in the last election. The vote was down, including in this state, which always leads the country, and it did again, but a lot of people stayed home. It enabled the lunatic fringe, as I call them, the Tea Party, to elect governors all over the country, and we see the damage that's being done. I mean, they're taking down murals in Maine because they portray labor. That's the least of what's going on. Some of the things that are going on in Indiana and in Michigan and elsewhere, the attacks on abortion, what they've done in the Dakotas, making a woman go to a clinic that's run by a non-professional 3 days before she decides to get an abortion, or she can get an abortion. This is ludicrous.
Well, I think what the lesson that I took away from the last election is that what Democrats need to do, and what we're trying to do in our efforts in the House of Representatives is really be much more clear about what Democrats stand for in a positive way, because I do think it's much more consistent with where most Minnesotans are, and it really is about fairness. Making sure that everybody's sharing in the responsibility, but also sharing in the prosperity, and it's about building a strong middle class, which has really been on the losing end of policies for the last 20-25 years, and and ultimately it's about a kind of honesty in how we go about doing our business. And I would say the most frustrating thing to me about this session, and we're about halfway through, is that that lack of honesty and transparency that's going on in how budgets are put together, in what we're going to focus on and what we're talking about, and what's really going on in people's lives. And when we start talking honestly about those things, I think people will come back to the Democratic Party, and we'll be able to move forward to a much more prosperous future together.
But what does it mean for this year's budget? We don't have the majority. The Democrats do not have the majority. How do we get a budget through? You know that the governor is going to really veto some of the draconian things. He's not going to do it through unallotment, which was proved unconstitutional by our own Supreme Court, another Pawlenty gambit. But how do we get the budget to move forward? How do we keep government running? How do we save 100,000 people from getting kicked off of Minnesota Care?
Well, I think the governor has been very clear about where his priorities are, and we in the state legislature share those priorities of fairness and honest budgeting. And he's also said, and I'm going to be willing to compromise. I'm going to be willing to go part way. What we need to do is get the Republicans to also come part way and accept things that they don't like, because we're going to be accepting things we don't like. The way we're going to do it is actually for people outside the Capitol to put pressure, because what happens in the Capitol is a reflection of where people are outside the Capitol. I mean, truly representative democracy works in that sense. So this weekend, next weekend, and then 2 weeks later, we as Democratic legislators are going to be going out all across the state, 25 cities over the next 2 weekends, to sit down with the people of Minnesota and put the governor's budget and the Republican majority's budget kind of side by side and lay out for them what the consequences are, because there's consequences to both decisions, and there's no question about that. And there's going to be good and bad outcomes from both proposals. But I think once people look at where Governor Dayton is, which is a balanced approach, which actually our state economist said is better for our fragile economy than the all cuts approach that the Republicans are putting on there, and the consequences of cutting nursing homes and cutting funding for schools and cutting funding for higher education and cutting funding for police and firefighters and snowplows through cuts to LGA and other aid that we give to cities. All those things lined up against where Governor Dayton is saying is let's tax the richest Minnesotans just a little bit more. I think Minnesotans... And
I don't hear them complaining.
And they're right. That's true. That's a very good point.
People in Governor Dayton's tax status, I haven't heard anybody come forward and complain that I don't see why I shouldn't pay my fair share. I don't object to having a level playing field. But we hear from the Republican side constantly that these people are going to run away from Minnesota, they're going to move away from Minnesota, businesses are going to move away from Minnesota. It's certainly, history belies that
right.
as a complete fallacy.
Yeah, and that's absolutely right, and we just have to keep pointing out those facts, because facts really do matter, and we should base our decisions on facts and history and not on made-up numbers and not on made-up rewritten history. And that's, that ultimately is what I see our job in the minority is doing, is holding the majority accountable for fair and honest and transparent politics.
It's more than holding their feet to the fire, it's throwing them into the fire, I think.
Well, at least holding their feet to the fire.
Another thing that bothered me terribly is when I saw how they treated LGA. They wanted to take it away from Duluth, Minneapolis, and St. Paul. Well, isn't that strange that those were three pretty solid Democratic areas without damaging the upstate Republican areas? And I think one of the shocks they had was to find out that, wait a second, Duluth is no longer the third largest city. It's now the fourth largest city, so we might be helping Duluth and hurting Bloomington. Well, things like that are also, to me, unconscionable.
Right. Well, when you look at these budgets, one thing that is really important to clarify, and I don't think the press has done that good a job on this, is that although it's targeting Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Duluth with deeper cuts, the LGA cuts, the property tax impacts, are all across the state. Every city that currently receives LGA gets a cut under the Republican budget. It's just much deeper in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Duluth. And in addition to that, there's other property tax cuts like the renter's credit. Renters are going to be paying $300 more per year in property taxes under the Republicans' proposals. That doesn't seem right. But to your point, $1.4 billion in property taxes. I just need to keep repeating that because that's what's in the tax bill that the Republicans have passed. But to your point, they really have targeted in a very partisan and transparently partisan way with no policy basis the central cities, which are represented by Democrats, and not just in the property tax bill, but also in the education bill, where they're eliminating integration funding. They're eliminating the rule that says we actually ought to have schools where that are integrated and not segregated. Another outrageous kind of proposal that I think that this Star Tribune and others now are coming on board and questioning, and I think that makes a lot of sense to question it. But the political partisanship of the budget that the Republicans are putting together, I think, is really unprecedented in at least modern Minnesota history, and really says a lot about where the state would be headed under in a very divisive way under a continued Republican control.
Well, I have said on other programs, and I really feel that they waited for 25 years to get control, and everything that they built up in that 25 years, they want to spew forth now, whether it's to the benefit of the people or not. It's really ideology as opposed to sanity, as far as I'm concerned. And one of the things we haven't talked about is the infrastructure of this state, which is in terrible shape. And Governor Pawlenty vetoed a bill in that regard. They overrode his veto on the transportation bill, but our roads are in awful shape. We have potholes here that you can, drive into and lose your car. Things have to be improved. Where would we have been this winter if we didn't have the people who were doing the snow plowing? They want to cut them back? Then who does without?
Well, when we've been out talking to cities across the state, and not just in the metro area, about the LGA cuts and other decisions being made at the state, the point you're making is the one that really came home most clearly to me. They say we can manage through some of the cutbacks in terms of providing some services, but what we're not doing, what we're really eliminating, is keeping up with maintenance of our roads and our bridges. We're not keeping on the schedule of keeping them good and whole. We're falling farther and farther behind, which is going to cost us more money. In Park Rapids, they said we had a choice in our city as property taxpayers between raising property taxes because of the cuts that LGA has brought down to them, or having sewage back up in our residents' basements. So the systems, you're absolutely right, the systems that we built in the last generation, because that generation stepped up and said we need to do this for the future, we're not taking care of those things, and it's going to cost us and our kids a lot more money when we have to rebuild them entirely. It's very short-sighted. And so the point you're making is something that is being pointed out and observed all across the state, and I think people are getting frustrated. It's just not the way we do things in Minnesota.
Another thing that I just read about was the fact that the cutbacks in terms of the state parks and personnel and money appropriated for the parks could result in closing as many as 26 state parks. Now, one of the things that this state thrives on is tourism. One of the things that makes it as attractive as it is tourism and bringing people here from other locations. We closed 26 state parks. We're not only putting the people who run those parks out of work, so we have more people unemployed, but we're making it less available for people to come in and to generate the revenue that would generate. Again, to me, this is a no-brainer.
Well, and kind of to build to this short-term versus long-term perspective, one of the solutions to that Steve Drazkowski, one of the Republican legislators, has come up with is we should just sell a couple of the parks, Whitewater and a couple others, and log them and use the proceeds from logging the parks to help fund other state parks. Again, a one-time, short-term solution to get us through what they say we don't need any more revenue to maintain.
Well, maybe they like to sell the state to the Koch brothers and just make an exchange. No, we can't go forward by privatizing. We can't take the things that have been fundamental in the building of this country and the building of this state and privatize them. And another thing they want to do is privatizing prisons. Well, what would that do? That would put a lot of people out of work also. Trained personnel.
Right.
That is not the answer.
Well, one of the scariest things I would say about the public safety budget, the corrections budget that's moving through the House, is that the level that they're funding it at, it looks like we actually are going to have to close one of our prisons while we're already overpopulated in our prisons. Now, that's a whole other issue that we could maybe talk about whether that's the way it should be. But currently, we have fairly full prisons, and if we close one of those prisons, where do those folks go?
We'll just turn them out. That's all. Just turn them out into the street.
It's just, it really is a very unrealistic approach to the challenges that we're facing in this state, and that really is incredibly frustrating. And at the end of the day, what we have to avoid, and I think Mark Dayton is going to be there, certainly the DFL legislators
Actually, the end of our day has just arrived because we're at the end of our half hour. You've got to come back, Paul Thissen.
Yes, absolutely.
And come back, and we've got to discuss this further.
I would like that.
Into the session. Thanks so much.